Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 15th of February and today's upload is really important because we're looking at a Russian advance in an area where the Ukrainians have been able to retain a semblance of continuity for a couple of weeks now, specifically in an outstretched pocket. So I really do want to look deeply at the Dakhne Andriivka likely region. I then want to look a bit further to the north at the Pokrovsk front. I want to look at some of the Ukrainian barbed wire defenses that were set up over the past couple of months, and more generally at the layers of defense they are planning and structuring north of the city of Pokrovsk. They're supposed to connect between Andriivka that you see over here with my cursor hovering over it and the border with Dnipro. I then want to move further eastwards and to the north to look at the Oskil bridgehead, where there are some interesting advances and continued Russian advances in Sverdlikovo. So all of that will be covered in today's video, and I apologize in advance if the resolution is a bit off, so I'm not going to zoom in and out much. I'm just going to stay on the same frames and discuss what we're seeing at hand. So let's begin with the Velyka Novosilka sector, where we see over here a Russian advance amounting to nearly 7 square kilometers of territory. The Russian forces have been making inroads in this region that is slightly west of the town of Velyka Novosilka and its suburb Andriivka for a couple of days now. And ever since then, they've been able to consolidate control of all of the fields in between the particular tree lines that Russian soldiers initially advanced through. And in total, we're able to advance nearly 3 kilometers northwards. And now they're beginning to approach the next defensive line built by the Ukrainians. They're about 1 kilometer away from this unified defensive line that the Ukrainians have set up that is running and spans, like 7 kilometers horizontally, which is an important intermediary defense line before you reach the more important Ukrainian buildup on the rear in an area near Fedorivka, which is protecting Komar. Komar being one of the most important Ukrainian supply junctions remaining in this sort of western parts of Donetsk, connecting to Dnipro and more generally connecting to other areas of the front line like Andriivka. So that's an area the Ukrainians are really keen on holding on to, and it's why they're currently propping up and retaining the same structure of forces. They're not moving any other forces to other parts of the front line. They're keeping the same garrison, including the 110th Brigade, in the same region to hold on to this trench line. It's just that looking back in retrospect, the Ukrainians did not invest a lot in building fortifications to bridge the gap between the really well-built Ukrainian defenses a bit to the west in Zaporozhye and the ones that are located, say, north of Velyka Novosilka. So as a result, you have this sort of 12.5 kilometer spanning open field region that really does not have many well-built trenches or anti-tank ditches, dugouts, anything of the sort in any unified manner in a distance of, say, 5 to 7 kilometers from the front line. You move a bit to the northwest and you reach the border with Dnipro, and then there are actually some defenses, but again, it's just one layer and it's mainly anti-tank ditches. So you can see there's not enough continuity between these two portions of trenches, and to Ukraine's credit, they've built a really robust network of defenses that really is unified without many gaps, starting from the eastern part of the oblast, spanning all the way to the Dnipro River over here to the west. You can see that, and actually I haven't updated the KML file of the trenches and of barbed wire, but the Ukrainians have actually expanded it a lot, especially on the sort of eastern seaboard of the Dnipro River leading up to the city of Zaporozhye. They've really invested and have increased the thickness of these yellow lines that you see over here that are supposed to protect the southern approaches to that city. So Ukraine has definitely invested in that regard. But looking at this gap over here, that's an area where the Russians could absolutely try to tap in and try to really continue with their current momentum. And they could play a role in reaching the Dnipro border, for instance, creating wedge between two strong Ukrainian points of defense, and then also to flank an area like Komar. So that's a part of why the Russians are investing the resources in these open fields in the first place. But again, we're not looking at anything too significant when it comes to major troop rotations in order to sort of capitalize on this fact. I'm just saying this is the state of Ukrainian defenses, and that just naturally Russian progression will sort of trend towards locations where there are less trenches once the Russians realize those are their best options for trying to advance deeper into Ukrainian lines. And so I'm just pointing it out many months before it actually becomes a significant fact on the line of contact. Over here a bit to the north of Novokamar, you can see the Russians were able to advance another 3 square kilometers This is due to footage being released from Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade, indicating that they were able to strike one Russian tank and two infantry fighting vehicles that dismounted or left their positions in Novokamar, advanced northwards, and approached a local Ukrainian stronghold. This was on February 14th, and it's a part of a Russian effort to begin to expand the perimeter around Rozdolnya, because now, for a couple of months, ever since really the end of November, the Ukrainians have been keeping the Russians at bay on the perimeter of this town, and it is of Russian interests to expand and utilize Rozdolnya as a forward staging point for infantry to then push westwards and reach the entirety of the Mokryali River villages, and then especially reach these open fields that are on high elevation near Rozhadnya that are overlooking Komar. And so that all begins with pushing out the current Ukrainian resistance, which is largely coming from the 23rd Mechanized Brigade, that continues to be exerted near these anti-tank ditches just to the north of the village of Rozdolnya. So that's why you're seeing a bit of an uptick in activity over there after a couple of months of less of that movement. Looking over here at Zelnivka, this is actually a conservative estimate for the extent of the Russian advance that's occurred over the past 24 hours, but it is universally being reported now that the Russian forces have been able to advance north of the Suryali River and dislodge the Ukrainians from some of their fort positions east of Zelenivka and then also within the hamlet itself. So the 37th Marine Brigade has played an integral role in retaining control of this hamlet and of the front line nearby. And for an extended period of time, they've been able to prevent the Russians from achieving any deep penetrations. They played a big role in conducting localized counterattacks whenever the Russians really got too close to comforts and were approaching some of the key local routes that enter into Ulakli. And they were able to keep this sort of stable distance from Ulakli of about 2 kilometers. But now that's beginning to change because the Russian forces have been able to capture about 1.5 square kilometers of really important territory, because it is essentially the eastern flank of Zelenivka, meaning that now the majority of the settlement is under Russian control or in a gray zone, meaning the Ukrainians have no other options or outlets for defense nearby. It's just open fields and areas where the Ukrainians never had the opportunity to build a sort of robust built up defense system. It's just tree lines. And this comes after months of just continued efforts to not cede any ground. So obviously that leads to increased attrition for the Ukrainian Marines over here. So inevitably it's going to be difficult for them to keep it up now that the Russians have been able to exploit the advances that they've been able to make. So over here you have 39th More Rifle Brigade. They're the main unit involved in this assault. And a big part of it is also try to cut off the remaining Ukrainian holdouts that are located about 14 kilometers east of Krakow at the largest extent, because right now, due to all of the Russian maneuvers that are going on within Andriivka and south of it, a pocket is formed that in width spans about 14 kilometers, or maybe I was mistaken, about 12.5 kilometers, but that is an absolutely insane depth, and it makes it extremely difficult for the Ukrainians to move in supplies and resources in any sort of safe manner to the Ukrainian forces that are really split up amongst different parts of this pocket near the front line, including just near the floodplains in Dakhny itself, which is even more concerning because imagine trying to cross through this corridor to enter into the basements in Dakhnia. They're almost cut off at this point, but nonetheless, they're still holding out to buy time for the Ukrainians in Ulakli and Konstantinopil, and then the remaining Ukrainians located in the fields south of Dakhnia. So now, due to this Russian advance to the west, it's sort of cutting off and approaching a physical encirclement of the Ukrainian battalions that are still operating to the east. So the Russians are about, say, 4 kilometers away from achieving that. And before they achieve that, the Ukrainians will eventually find it in themselves to withdraw, but they're trying to drag out time for as long as possible in order to allow the Ukrainians to remain in their positions in Konstantinopil and Ulakli, as I reiterated. But again, the fact that there are just large swaths of open fields over here is a difficult situation for the Ukrainians in Ulakli because they are the inevitable targets. And Andriivka itself is also in a large predicament because the Russian forces continue to advance. And at this point, we understand that they are in control of the large part of the center, but they're now beginning to seep into the outskirts, including the southern outskirts near the Orlova River, where they were recently able to take over additional houses, and then also near the western outskirts, where the Russians are beginning to chip away at the northern trench line built by the Ukrainians, built on a key ridge. So now the Russians are also taking over those higher elevated locations that overlook areas like Bakhatir and Oleksivka, which is supposed to be the natural Ukrainian fallback line when the entirety of Andriivka falls. So that's particularly concerning. At the same time, Dakhnia, you can see that the Ukrainians from at least one battalion of the 33rd Brigade, they continue to resist over here. And it is impressive that they've not been completely cut off physically, despite the extremely narrow routes and track that they have to do on a daily basis to move in and out. But now the Russians are beginning to chip away to an extremely dangerous degree because they've been able to capture a couple of other houses in the local hospital, leaving the Ukrainians remaining in a couple dozen houses that are near the center or western edges of the town, all a part of what I said before, trying to drag out the fighting and distract, sort of pin down Russian forces that are much larger in numerical strength in this particular location, so they can be used to exert force on the Ukrainians that are located, say, 10 kilometers to the west. Now, to move northwards, you're going to see over here in Pokrovsk that the situation has stabilized for the Ukrainian side. They've been able to send in reinforcements to conduct localized counterattacks in areas like Udachne, Kotline, Pischane as well, where we've not seen any changes since the last video. And then also in Dakhnia to the east over here, or not Dakhnia, but Dechenske. We talked about this in an earlier video. The Ukrainians were able to capture 1.3 square kilometers of territory. The 68th Ager Brigade on February 14th, they released footage of their forces entering into the eastern portion of the town, although we don't have any confirmation that the western sections or the warehouses to the south have fallen as well. But it does appear that they've been able to give the Ukrainians in this sort of second to last line of defense around Pokrovsk a bit of breathing space, because you could say there are really two layers left to the city. You have the first layer, which is the line of contact, where a lot of trenches have been built, and those have been an integral part of why the Russian forces have been unable to advance any deeper. And then you have the ring that runs around the immediate perimeter of Pokrovsk, which still hasn't been penetrated, but also has some significant gaps, specifically in populated areas like Leontovichi and Troyednaya. That's because the Ukrainians simply, they had to do a analysis of where trenches were most needed. And of course, the area that's completely open needs it more than the area where there are houses nearby. So it was really a decision that was necessary, but then it also leaves a gaping hole in an area where the Russians are currently located. And that's a part of the rationale behind the Ukrainian counterattacks occurring in Pischane, because then it denies the Russians access to a route that eventually would lead to an open area that doesn't have the perimeter ring around the immediate vicinity of Pokrovsk. But for now, you're seeing that really the Russian offensive potential in some of these areas has culminated for the time being. I'm not going to say anything definitive, but just in the short term, that's sort of culminated, which is completely understandable because we've been covering since the summer of 2024 the Russian advances that occurred, that expanded out of Selidove all the way to this location over here without any operational rest in between for a lot of the units. So now you're beginning to see some rotation, and the unit that was pushed out of Dechenske, for instance, the Russian unit, is actually a motorized rifle regiment consisting of Russian soldiers that were taken from the Black Sea Fleet. So it's just a regiment of those individuals. In the same way, there's also one of Russian forces from the Air Force that is operating in the Kursk region. So all in all, the Ukrainians really are banking on Pokrovsk remaining under their control for an extended period of time. I would say they're hoping for it to remain under their control for, at the very least, the beginning portion of 2025, like the first 6 months, but preferably for the entirety of 2025. The issue is really with the western flank of Pokrovsk, not necessarily the eastern flank, although we'll get to it in a moment, but the western flank is more concerning due to how close the Russians are to reaching the E50 highway, and then from there, the route from the northwest, which connects to various cities in Dnipro. You could see them as you zoom out, like Pavlograd. So there are two key routes that are pretty close to a lot of Russian firepower outlets. And that's one of the key reasons why long-term sustenance for Pokrovsk is unlikely, although in the medium term, it is possible because the Ukrainians have been able to prevent Russian physical breakthroughs occurring through these open fields. But it can only last for so long because of the obviously finite amount of men that are involved in the defense over here, and then the complete lack of settlements to be used as bases of defense in this nearby region, let alone any trenches that could be used. It's just open fields and tree lines for about 4 kilometers before you reach the populated regions and the supply routes. So that's the issue for Pokrovsk, but compared to last year where the main center of gravity was in Andriivka, the situation here is not as bad because of the capacity that the Ukrainians have displayed for counterattacks in this location, which clearly the Ukrainians, if there is any sort of potential for negotiations, they would really prefer that when there is a ceasefire, Pokrovsk remain under their control as a forward garrison. And combined with Murad having a population of like 200,000 before the war, it would be a massive center of gravity for Ukrainian defense in the entire region. So that's a part of why they're also willing to expend more resources in defense over here. So as I said before, the fact that they were able to display localized counterattacks, the fact that the flanks aren't as lethal as they were in Avdiivka, they're not as lethal from the east especially, the fact that there are well-built trench systems largely around the vicinity of the city, and then also on its eastern approaches, also to the west, but to a lesser degree. All of that plays a role in making it a more defendable position. Also, just the fact that there are way more structures, it's way more dense, way more built out in terms of surface area than Avdiivka. So that's just a comparison to last year. But at the same time, as we're seeing the western flank sort of die down, the eastern flank located, let's measure it actually, away from Mirnorod, it's about 12 kilometers away. The Russians are increasing the pace of their advances. Over here, they were able to capture nearly 12 square kilometers of territory within a couple of days, based on a geolocated video from, I think it was the Unmanned Systems Battalion of the 15th National Guard Brigade. They dropped grenades onto 3 Russian soldiers that were approaching the T-0504 highway, which we now know is physically cut off, but there are some Ukrainian sources talking about them successfully counterattacking in Velyka Novosilka, although I never marked it as under Russian control, so it's not necessarily a confirmed fact of the matter that the Ukrainians even counterattacked, but for sure they are located in that area. At the same time, though, the actual movements that are verified based on geolocations are ones showing the Russians solidifying control over large swaths of open fields that are in between the road that sort of runs perpendicular to the highway over here, and then also Yelizaveta. So all those fields in between where my cursor is now hovering over, those are now under Russian control. This is largely being done by the 5th Motor Rifle Brigade, the same unit that played a significant role in the capture of Krakow in the December period. So now they're continuing with their offensive activities. And you can see how the Russians now have a foothold on pretty high elevation, on a higher elevated area that they previously did not have access to because they were located on a river valley south of the Turets River. It now gives them the opportunity to advance westwards through large swaths of open field as well, in areas that are not as dense in trenches, all the way to areas like Mykolaievka and Myryliobivka, meaning that the new natural defense line for the Ukrainians will be built around these populated areas and the Turets River, which is defendable, but it's an area that does also have gaping holes in its defense, and not as many troops are currently devoted to defending it on a constant basis. It would also give the Russians control of high elevation that is closer to Mirnorod and is actually on parity with the city in terms of elevation, and actually overlooks certain locations that are a bit to the east of it, especially near the river valley. So there are a lot of benefits for the Russians to exploiting these recent advances in order to situate themselves in a way that gradually will allow them to close in and attrit the Ukrainian forces that are currently operating in Mirnorod. So all of that is being taken into account with these movements. Moving a bit to the north, I want to look at the situation developing in the Oskil River region. So as you guys can see over here in yellow, I have the recent Russian advances since my last upload. This includes the entire capture of Novokamar and a bit of an advance to the north. So you can see over here it amounts to 1.4 square kilometers of territory acquired by the Russian side, including a lot of landings and small hills that are pretty close to the western riverbank. Then you could see that the Russians advanced deeper into the Velyka, including the Pidvarki district, one of the northernmost districts in the town. In total, the capture of Pidvarki and fields a bit to the north amounts to a allocation by the Russians of another 3.7 square kilometers into their hands. You can also see that the Russians were able to advance and strengthen the sort of very deep spearhead that was initially acquired by the Russian advances on February 6th into Velyka. We talked about this and how there were FPV strikes by the 112th National Guard Brigade on Russian forces in these houses. So that was an initial assault. Now they've been able to turn it into a permanent outpost due to the flanks being widened, meaning that the Russians are really situating themselves in a way that would allow them to then push westwards towards the highest elevated regions in the entire sector. But that would require the Russians to push a bit further westwards. I would say they'd have to reach the territory that is near the highway, but just a bit to the east of it in some of these forested areas. And that still requires an advance of another 5 kilometers deeper into the Ukrainian rear. This is an area where, for instance, the Russians do have a pretty significant superiority in FPV drones, as reported on by Ukrainian garrison over here. The Ukrainian breakdown of forces over here is very poor. We've talked about this before, and how it consists of just several battalions, drone units, and then just one National Guard brigade being the largest formation, and then the best formation being a battalion of a mountain assault brigade. But all in all, it's like 2,000 or 2,500 men over here, and perhaps the Russians at the current bridgehead don't have as many men at the same time, but they are able to rotate with a much larger garrison of forces from the 2nd Motor Rifle Division located in the Vilshana region in the direction of Kupiansk. So all in all, the Russians were able to sustain their attacks for an indefinite period of time, and the Ukrainian garrison over here is really one that you would relegate to a front of lower importance, and it has been a front of lower importance, the Oskil River area, for a very long time. But now the situation has obviously changed, and there is a potential for Russian deep penetrations, and so now the situation has to reflect that. And so we still have not seen any public proof of the Ukrainians redirecting forces from Kupiansk or from the Vovchansk region to sort of set up a stable defense line to conduct a localized counterattack to prevent deep Russian penetrations. None of that has happened yet. And the longer this goes on, the more Russia will be able to settle into this region, build permanent pontoon bridges, move armored vehicles across, and from there on in, they'll be able to really open up this front in a way that would be significant in terms of territory acquired, and it could then play a big role in Russia's final standing in the locations of Kharkiv Oblast going into any potential negotiations. So that's something to really keep in mind moving forward, and it could be a part of Russia's considerations when they continue to commit resources into such locations. You can see over here in Sverdlikovo, this is important because this is the only significant movement in Kursk over the past couple of days. The Ukrainian counterattack south of Suja has completely died down by now. But an area that actually is of importance right now is Sverdlikovo, wherein the Russians have captured 1.2 square kilometers of territory. You can see over here on February 14th, the Alaster FPV unit of the 116th Mechanized Brigade, they struck houses wherein Russians were located. They also struck individual Russian soldiers that were walking through open paths to reach the town. They were striking basements that were acting as entrances and hiding spots for Russian soldiers. And they, of course, claimed that there were North Korean soldiers involved as well, with the 115th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. So all of those elements. There was a couple other geolocations. This one from the 36th Marine Brigade of FPV strikes and grenade drops onto Russian soldiers in these houses. And then also an advance stretched out westwards to indicate that nearly the entirety of the settlement is under Russian control. The Russians are committing a large quantity of forces to this location, not just as Sverdlikovo, but to the nearby towns as well that are pretty close to the border between Kursk and Sumy. So this includes a lot of air assault elements like the 51st Regiment, and I'm just going to click on the icons over here because I moved them in recently to reflect the new situation on the front line with the order of battle. You could see them over here on the map. And you also have Chechen elements like this Akhmat Motor Rifle Regiment. So there is a wide array of forces involved. And now what's going to be interesting is to see how the Russians begin to strengthen their positions leading into Sverdlikovo, because right now it's pretty thin due to the bulk of the advances being done along one particular road, but there aren't any other large-scale Ukrainian defensive strongholds that could be used to prevent the Russians from advancing deeper southwards. It's just an area of open fields, a gray zone, you could say, all the way to the anti-tank ditches near the border with Sumy, and that would be eventually where the line would sort of stabilize. And if that's the case, then the Russians will then have a pretty strong starting point, starting basis to begin their approaches eastwards, which is the ultimate goal of why the Russians are even penetrating into Sverdlikovo in the first place. The objective is to reach the next line of villages running near the, I think it's called the Reka Luknaya River, which includes Lebedivka, Luknaya itself. And then from there, you reach an area that is pretty open, doesn't contain that many, say, trenches or villages in between. And then you actually reach Suja itself from the western entrances, whereas the Ukrainians have committed a lot of their offensive capacity, but also just generally defensive resources to protecting the eastern approaches or northeastern approaches to Suja. But then there's also the possibility of the Russians coming in from the west, utilizing some of the key roads in this region to actually begin to cut it off from that location. It's a significant concern for the Ukrainians because they've made it clear, based on political actions and based on military actions with the deployment of forces, that they want to dig in their feet over here in Kursk indefinitely. And so having this sort of exposed western flank is something that cannot be tolerated for the Ukrainians if they want to have a long-term stay in this Kursk region. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.